Hi, and hello all. Let's get into Unit 6 of APUSH, which is the Industrial Revolution and the Progressive Era. So this takes place pretty much right after the era of Reconstruction. Let's chalk it up to 1890 to 1910. How about that? But let's get into the causes for industrialization. We have five causes. The first one that I want you to think about is similar to the market revolution, and well, part of this reason is similar to the market revolution. And this reason is that there is a plethora of natural resources and there is a unified America. Let's tackle that one by one. So, a plethora of natural resources. We've seen this in the market revolution because land brings these natural resources. The trees have wood, the ground has coal. Like, take the California gold rush and the gold mines that were present in there. Mines had all the resources besides just gold. They had iron and coal. And now that we have so much land, like literally at this point in time, like the whole continent of North America is a part of the American Union. So we have a lot of land and a lot of natural resources. And not only that, we're also getting it from overseas trade. So that's another thing to account for. And what I mean by the unification of America, well, directly, it's just we won the Civil War. The South is once again a part of the American Union, and we're on good terms because we've accepted that slavery is a thing of the past. But something to also think about that I should have stressed last video is the North being a more industrial side of America and the South being a more agrarian side of America, where the North had always had this focus on manufacturing. Take, for example, the Massachusetts Lowell Mill Girls. Meanwhile, the South had much more of a focus on agrarianism and just agriculture. Take literally slave plantations. Like, all of that stuff was very, like, that was something else that attributed to sectional tensions, where we had a side more focused on industrialism and another focused on agrarianism. But now that the North had won the Civil War, not only does that mean that slaves are free, but that also means that agrarianism and a more agrarian lifestyle has taken a back seat. And now we have a country focused on industrialization as a whole rather than just one half focusing on it. So, in turn, that also brings us to reason number two, which is a heightened labor supply, where we have a whole lot of middle to low class workers in the working class who are working to get money. They need jobs if they want to sustain a lifestyle, but at the same time, we have this influx of immigration, not only from a new wave of immigrants that are going to enter into America during this time period, but also old immigrants. Like, take for example, again, during the market revolution, we had this influx of Irish immigrants come in who would work, just they would participate in the American workforce. So taking the current very bloated American workforce and having like adding that to the immigrant workforce just gives us like thousands upon thousands of workers. The third reason is that we have a greater domestic market, which pretty much means we have a lot of people who can buy a lot more. We don't have a very like poor, we don't have like a very poor class, like a very low class, like wow, excuse me. We don't have a very poor low class. Like, we have people who can buy these commodities, and here we also kind of see a rise in consumer culture. I didn't mention it in this because I didn't see it that important, but this also serves as a good example. We have carnival fairs coming up. We have attractions and leisure time being spent. Like, money is being spent on those. Like, P.T. Barnum is a connoisseur in those kinds of like in that entertainment industry or carnivals and such. But yeah, pretty much we have a lot of people who have the money to spend on a lot of products. That's pretty much the point of reason number three. Reason number four, increases in small businesses and entrepreneurs. Again, we have more people just entering America and we have them chasing money. They want to make money. And we're gonna talk about that a bit later too. With immigrants specifically, but like, immigrants and Americans alike both wanted to make a lot of money. They wanted to rise in the class system. And that's where small businesses and entrepreneurs are born, which again allows the cycle of money to continue in America. Reason number five, governments wanted more business. Because, like I just said, this helps the economy. This keeps it flowing properly, and this just stimulates it and makes sure that generally there is a profit for all. Moving forward, let's go through our major industrialists. I'm pretty sure a lot of this is known. I mean, this is eighth grade material. I'm just gonna like you're gonna see I got really lazy with the slides here because it's just supposed to jog your memory. Like the main stuff about this is all the different viewpoints and stuff. We'll get into that. But first one, first one, Henry Ford, automobile industry, duh. Produced the assembly. He coined the assembly line later in the um 1900s, 1910s, around that time. But yeah, he was very big in the automobile industry. Next up, Andrew Carnegie, steel industry. He used the Bessemer process to produce buttloads more of steel at a faster rate, and he benefited off of other industries. Like think about New York City. Think about how much steel has to go in there. How many like just for construction and like and also think about just for a more historically accurate example, the railroad industry. The railroad industry needed steel if it wanted to function. That's how you get the product of railroads. So those two companies kind of worked hand in hand, and that's how a lot of the profit was made for Carnegie Steel. John D. Rockefeller, Rockefeller Oil, like I state here, he controlled 95% of America's oil because that's just how much he dominated that industry. And if you know your history, and you know a certain board game, you know that this is like a monopoly. This like he controlled pretty much the whole like oil like that the whole industry of oil. Excuse me, sorry, the whole industry of oil. And yeah, he was just a really good oil manufacturer. To keep it simple. Okay. J.P. Morgan, he didn't dominate a particular industry, but he was this very wealthy banker who pretty much I just think he had a lot of money and he used that money wisely. He invested, he had relations with all the other industrialists present here. And a fun example that I like to think of just to put into perspective the amount of wealth that someone like JP Morgan had, he bailed the governments out of debt. He bailed the the US government out of debt. That takes a insane amount of money, and the president at that time, Teddy Roosevelt, was embarrassed of it because that just goes to show the power that these industrialists had, and goes to show like the influence and power that they had. Final one, Cornelius Vanderbilt. Vanderbilt's the railroads. That's a common way to remember it, but yeah, he just dominated the railroad industry. Methods towards success. So how did these industrialists just become successful? Because what separates you starting up your lemonade stand from Cornelius Vanderbilt's successful railroad industry? First things first, they established trusts and monopolies. So, like I just said, like monopolies, they just show dominance in the industry where you have this unchecked and unfair power over everything in that industry. So, again, let's use the example of a lemonade stand. Um, on Jedwood, we have 8 houses, each with their own lemonade stand. And I'm one of those houses. Let's just say we have a lot more people coming to my house compared to your houses, and that's because of some other tactics that we'll get into and some other business practices that were employed. But that's just like visualize monopoly. Like we have everyone pretty much just going to this one lemonade stand or this one company because it's just the most beneficial for them, and and in turn it benefits the company with the monopoly severely. Trust is just accumulation of a massive amount of money within one company. Moving forward, scientific management slash Taylorism, founded by Frederick Winslow Taylor, and this was just more so an analytical and logical way of handling a task. So, really, just applying like take peeling a banana. If I want to get like, there are 2 ways you can peel a banana. Let's like the harder way is just like I take a knife, I chop up a banana like I would chop up like a carrot, and then like pinch off the banana peel, and then I have my banana slices. But in like a Taylorist way of thinking, you would like think about how do I make this more convenient and more like easy, yet I still get the same product and I get the same result, which would just be our modern way of peeling a banana. Because hopefully you don't do the first option because that'd be kind of weird. But you just take it from like you hold the top and then you just peel back. Like think about it like that. The most efficient way, logical way of and analytical way to handle a task, breaking it down, making it as easy as possible while also getting the same products. And that was just better economically for because it made things faster and made things easier. And horizontal and vertical integration. So horizontal integration was focused on combining industries. So like again, back to the lemonade stand. Let's say my big lemonade stand, I want to get bigger. I want to get even more profit. I'm going to go to three of the different lemonade stands on Jedwood Street and I'm going to be like, hey, why don't we team up? Why don't I give you some money and I get ownership of your lemonade stand and I use it for my own profit? That's pretty much horizontal integration. But vertical integration, on the other hand, would just be focusing on buying the companies needed to like promote your main industry. So before I go to the lemonade stand example, let's use a more direct example. We have Vanderbilt's railroads. So Vanderbilt, what does a railroad need? It needs wood, it needs steel, and it needs people to place the railroads down, right? So I would need to focus on buying out companies that like sell these products. So Carnegie Steel, I would have good relations with Carnegie Steel. I'd buy a bunch of their steel. Wood, I would find a good like wood company that harvests wood. I would buy them out, or I would just purchase a large amount of wood from them at like for a profit, of course. And then workers, I find a whole bunch of like desperate low class workers who need a job, and I have them placed on my railroads. Like generally, with all that, you would have a massive profit. But back to the lemonade stand, if that's just simpler for someone to understand, a lemonade stand needs wood to set up the actual stand. You need cups, let's say glass cups, to buy to like actually like disperse the lemonade, and then you need a way to get your lemonade. So I go to BJ's. I have a good relationship with BJ's. I get a whole bunch of lemonade at a discount. I go to Home Depot. I have good relations with Home Depot. I get a whole bunch of wood at a discount, and I go to some place that sells glass cups. I don't know, and I get glass cups at a discount. Like just think about it like that. You're buying the companies that give you the materials you need for your industry. So you might be thinking, how are monopolies here justified? How is like how can such dominance be justified? Like why isn't it in check? Because like I said, it's unchecked and unfair. And also like how can you justify like using these like desperate low class workers and pretty much just exploiting them for a significant profit? The first thing just to assess like dominance in an industry is social Darwinism. The best way to describe this is survival of the fittest. Darwinism is based on that concept of survival of the fittest. So social Darwinism, by extension, obviously, is based off that same principle. If you are the fittest to succeed, you are entitled to as much success as you gain. If um let's say I was the buffest guy out there and I let's say I was like the like number one strongest guy. I go to like every Olympic, like I lift all the weights, bam, I win every gold medal. Like I'm dominating in the Olympics, but that's because I deserve it because I'm the strongest man alive. So yeah, pretty much that idea. And industrialists use that idea, that popular idea, just to justify their success. Another reason, laissez-faire capitalism. Very sure you heard this if you had O'Brien and Mistrota, like in eighth grade. Like laissez-faire capitalism is based on this idea of a hands-off government where the government doesn't impede on economics because they don't regulate anything. That's the important part. They don't regulate industry. They don't regulate economics. They let everything sort itself out because that's just the thought process. That's the economic policy of this time. Similarly to how in Unit 2, mercantilism was an economic policy at the time. For Unit 6 here, laissez-faire is the economic policy put in place. So yeah, hands-off government, the government doesn't do anything, so industrialists have their own free rule to do whatever they want, pretty much, and no one's going to stop them. Because government won't stop them. Who else is going to stop them? And we'll get into that later, because labor unions might stop them. And here we kind of get into different viewpoints, like I said earlier, different viewpoints on industrialists, where we have captains of industry versus robber barons. Are industrialists these entrepreneurs, these successful entrepreneurs that everyone should look up to, that should see as like the idol, like someone you should idolize and like the model for success? Or are they people who have these unjust business practices that are exploiting workers and are benefiting off of their torment? Well, let's start with robber barons. Here are just some depictions of robber barons, like industrialists as robber barons. Let's start with this top left image. We have a whole lot of the working class, the poor class, holding up the industrialists, these robber barons who are literally sitting on money bags. Like they are benefiting off of the hard work of the low class. They aren't putting in much work. That's the viewpoint that someone would take if they believe that industrialists were evil. And this just goes to show like the poor treatment of the working class, where they like despite working, holding up these rich industrialists, they are stuck in sort of a perpetual state of just lifting them up. Moving forward to this bottom right image, we have industrialists who are literally invading the Senate, which goes to show the amount of power they had. Like I said with J.P. Morgan, like industrialists had like crazy power. Like J.P. Morgan himself bailed out the U.S. government, and now we see their influence spreading not only just in economics but in politics too. And this is just another reason why they could be seen as robber barons, because just that's just generally like the evil way of seeing them. But this also just goes to show like a separate idea that the influence of industrialists is spanning too wide, and it's getting into places that it shouldn't be, which just is a call toward regulating um industrialists. But yeah, just moving a bit forward, we also have this idea of grotesque luxury, where look at this home. Like, this is the Vanderbilt vacation home, a vacation home for the Vanderbilt family of the railroad industry. And just looking at it, this seems so unnecessarily grand and intricate. And that's another reason why robber barons were looked upon as they are, because they spent so much unnecessary money on vacation homes and on unnecessary things. But on the other hand, on the side of the captains of industry, we have people like Andrew Carnegie who promote using your wealth toward philanthropic or charitable needs. Like Carnegie himself, he often donated large sums of money toward libraries and other infrastructure, and that in turn boosted the image, like that reinforced the positive image of industrialists. However, not all industrialists were like Carnegie, but yeah, that just these are just some examples that goes to show the different sides of industrialists, where robber barons were seen as these tyrants in the economic world, where they exploited their workers and just piggybacked off their work. Meanwhile, people like Carnegie are promoting this idea that wealth is something that was earned, and we are indebted to society to circulate funds back to society, and that's why he donated money to charities and such. Let's move into immigration. So, like I talked about earlier, we have old immigration, which started with Irish immigrants. This is because of push factors primarily. The first, well, the most obvious being the Irish potato famine, which near the time of the market revolution was attracting, well, it wasn't really attracting, it was forcing a lot of people out of Ireland because food was no good. So they had to go to America, which was one of the best options to migrate to. They were part of the working class, large majority of them, despite facing discrimination and intense nativism. Nativism, as I might remind you, is just heavy discrimination from Americans toward immigrants. But now we move into new immigration during this current time period, which comes with Polish immigrants, but primarily Chinese immigrants. So Chinese immigrants come through into America because of pull factors, and I quote here, streets made of gold, because that's what immigrants were. That's the image that immigrants had in their head about America. That's how rich and wealthy and how much capital America was producing on a world stage, where it was thought that the streets of America were paved with gold itself, that they were made of gold. And so that attracted a lot of immigrants, and primarily Chinese immigrants. And in California, we see a large surplus of Chinese immigrants congregating in that state, and we have Chinatowns being formed where they're kind of like their own little cultural sphere of Chinese culture in America. And with this large influx of immigrants, like I said, we have a poor working class, so that forms ghettos slash cultural enclaves. It's very similar, so I group them together. But we also have the development of tenement buildings, where these are just like really, 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 really crappy apartments that we're gonna get into in the progressive era that will be fixed, but they were so cramped they fit like people were forced to like 8 people were forced to fit in one room. There was like no personal space at all. Beds were stacked like reaching the roof. It was just really crappy housing. And ghettos and cultural enclaves, same thing. Literally just a lot of immigrants just gathered up within these areas within cities, just filled with tenement apartments where it would house like thousands of them in such cramped, crappy, like poor conditioned houses and apartments. But yeah, that's immigration pretty much. But That's not immigration, pretty much. Because the main thing about immigrants in the workforce is that they were very easy to exploit. There were a lot of immigrants who didn't know how much they should be paid, how much the dollar was worth, really. So a lot of factory owners underpaid them and they made them work long, excruciating hours. Because remember, they have a fresh start here. They don't really have money. They don't have proper housing. They're desperate for money. And that's also similar to what happened with African Americans after Reconstruction in the Freedmen's Bureau, where they also kind of faced the same kind of treatment, where they were easy to exploit because they needed the money. So, like, a lot of emphasis and a lot of conditions were set just so that at the end of the day, they're getting their money, but it's not as much they could be making, so that the factory owner and the industrialist can make an even greater profit. And with Chinese immigrants comes an even greater sense of nativism with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1828. Let's just reference the cartoon really quick. Throwing down the ladder by which they rose, which I feel like sums up the Chinese Exclusion Act, where it's what it sounds like. It's excluding Chinese immigrants from entering America. I know this is way before the Industrial Revolution, but this didn't necessarily block out all Chinese immigrants. But what it did do is that it set a significant limit on the amount. It set a quota pretty much. And that very much prevented a lot of Chinese immigrants from entering America. And those who were even present were facing extreme nativism. Moving forward, we move on to labor. So, like I've been talking about, workers have been constantly exploited. They've been facing very crappy working conditions, low wages. No worker is gonna like that. That's like if you worked a summer job. Let's say you worked at the pool. Your friend also works at the pool. They make $20 an hour. You make $10 an hour, and you have to clean the very nasty pool. Meanwhile, they just get to work at the front desk. You're not gonna be happy about that, and you have a whole lot of other co-workers who have similar conditions, and they're not happy about that. That's pretty much what a labor union is, and we see this again. Well, we see this before with the Lowell Mill Girls, where they also formed their own little labor union, although it wasn't really called a labor union. It was kind of a labor union where they just fought against their factory owner for better conditions. And it's similar here, where labor unions are fighting against that, but they're also fighting to get rid of unjust business practices, like we've been talking about with like exploiting workers. I'm repeating myself, but you get the point. And some of the big labor unions we'll cover right now. The first of which is the National Labor Union, founded in 1861. Here are just some of the goals that these labor unions were trying to press: 8 hours labor, 8 hours recreation, 8 hours rest, 8 hours of work, 8 hours of leisure time, and then 8 hours of sleep. You might think, wow, that's pretty much what we have today. It wasn't what we had back then. Like, it was very bad back then because work hours would span way above like 10 hours, and rest time and recreation time were very minimal. Like, it was just work, sleep, go. Well, I messed that up really badly. It was sleep, wake up, work, sleep, pretty much. Like, that was life. But yeah, the National Labor Union was just fighting against like high hours and low wages, and but specifically here, just high hours. In addition to the National Labor Union, or the National Labor Union, we also have the Knights of Labor, coined and founded in 1881, where one of their focuses was just trying to settle disputes between a factory owner and the factory workers more passively, less violence. Because the main way of dealing with like the main way of combating unjust business practices with workers was striking. Like, that's how labor unions primarily focused on like settling issues. Like, we're not gonna work until you change this and that, and that just rises tensions. That makes things sour. And one of the goals of the Knights of Labor was just to find other ways to more peacefully and diplomatically resolve disputes. Final one I want to talk about is the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, founded in 1886. Again, they just focused on work hours. Like here, 8 hours, 8 hours of work labor, and again, that was just one of their focuses. They were the model for a lot of labor unions, and they were the biggest as well. But just to sum everything up, National Labor Union, equal wages, equal support for African American workers and female workers. Knights of Labor, founded by Terence Powderly, abolished child labor trusts and monopolies, and again, like I just said, get rid find civil ways to combat disputes beyond just striking. And AFL, Largest of the groups, like I said, founded by Samuel Gompers, higher wages and better working conditions. So you pretty much just get the gist of labor unions here, where it's just organizations working toward combating unjust business practices. Politics during this time not as spicy as they were in times past, but still, nonetheless, I like I like it, and we're gonna talk about it because some of it does show up. Populism. Farmers fight industrialism. This populism was seen as the party of the people. This was the Populist Party, and it formed to fight and combat industrialization. And think about it: what group currently would want to fight industrialization? Agrarian farmers in the South who lost a lot of their limelight. They're out of the limelight now since Civil War is over and America is now primarily industrial. So here we have this group called the Grange, who was this populist group like formed of like agrarian farmers who supported the Populist Party, and it was just like I said, just populism fighting industrialism. But the main thing about populism comes with the Panic of 1893 and the silver problem. So with the Panic of 1893 came issues on how was currency going to be represented? Was it going to be with silver or was it going to be with gold? Seems like a very simple issue, but there was a sentiment to it within the people. Gold had often been used and issued by the government, and the Populist Party contended that because that was something not of the people, not that the people supported and rooted for, that was something the government enforced, that was something that the government employed. And silver was something that the people supported and that they wanted to employ. So, although the silver problem on the surface seems like just, oh, gold or silver, really, it's a manifestation of the conflict between the people and the government officials, those the high class per se. And one of my favorite things to come out of this whole conflict is William Jennings Bryan's Cross of Gold speech. So Bryan is pretty much advocating for the pro silver cause because he's saying that a gold currency is restricting the supply of money and it's leading to deflation and it's producing economic hardships for Americans. It's making it harder to have a good living with money. And he says here, you should not crucify man on a cross of gold. Like just listening to that in like at the moment would evoke a lot of strong emotion, and that his his speeches would sway a lot of people toward the populist and pro silver cause here. Moving forward, we go into the progressive era where we solve all of the issues we just discussed with industrialization, with industrialists abusing their power and poor working conditions and tenements and immigration and everything. So here we have the president for this time period, one of my favorites, Teddy Roosevelt. He's raking the muck. And that might sound familiar because a common term to refer to progressivists, as I like to call them, is muckrakers. Muckrakers or progressivists were people who worked in the progressive era to solve the issues with society, like I did, wow, like I just talked about, like housing, working conditions, immigrant conditions, etc., etc., etc. But let's move forward. Progressivists. Number one, Jacob Riis. Should be familiar if you had O'Brien. Two eyes that showed the world something, something, something. That's because he was a photographer and he exposed issues in the lower class with housing and he published How the Other Half Lives. What this did is that it drew a lot of attention from everyone in America about how crappy the conditions were for for the low class and those living in tenement apartments, and that was just called toward improving the conditions of those living in those areas. So that's solving housing in a way. Also solving housing in a way is Jane Addams with her also combating issues in tenements and housing where she's setting up all these new houses. She's constructing these, she's having people work on them so she, like the low class and working class can have better housing. She herself has her own like super duper advanced house called the Hull House that serves sort of as like in a way, sort of like a homeless center where you had all these people who were living in these crappy tenement apartments going to the Hull House to settle down temporarily until they found better housing. Moving forward, Ida Tarbell, Tar Oil. She oh crap. She tackled issues in the oil industry. She exposed Rockefeller Standard Oil. She knocked it down a peg. She was trying to dismantle the monopoly that Standard Oil had over all oil in America. So yeah, she tackled oil. Lincoln Steffens, my favorite muckraker, he tackled issues in city politics. So what I mean by that is when let's go back to immigrants being easy to exploit, like I discussed earlier. So they might not they're not only easy to exploit economically, but they're also easy to exploit politically, as many city governments like Tammany Hall in New York and the leader of Tammany Hall, Boss Tweed, they would often entice and influence the votes of their like of their city government by bribing bribing poor immigrants and sort of messing with the votes as well, messing with the ballot. And that led to corrupt city politics where whoever was in power just made sure they stayed in power through any means necessary. And Lincoln Steffens ran an expose on these corrupt city governments with The Shame of the Cities, which also inspired another, um, I think of him sort of like a mini muckraker, Robert Leffoy. I don't even know how to say that, but you see it, you know his name. And he pretty much did the same thing that Steffens did in Wisconsin. And what Steffens' work did is that it gave voters new power and how they can like fight back against these corrupt city governments. Because like the whole reason that these corrupt city governments had the ability to stay in power wasn't only through their like very shady means, but also because civilians had no power. They didn't have any political power to combat it. And what Lincoln Steffens does is that he urges the government to give the civilians power, which they get through the actions of referendum, recall, and initiative. Boom. Next one, Frank Norris. He tackled the railroad industry, and to ours, railroad. That's how I remember. That's how Brian probably told you if you had a Brian. But yeah, issues in the railroad monopolies. Monopoly. I don't know why I put monopolies. But he published the Octopus, which the Octopus itself, wow, itself is a cartoon. There is a political cartoon about the octopus, where it's just like this, like a big octopus in the center of an island, like stretching out all of its tentacles to all these different companies, and it just shows, it visualizes the monopoly that Vanderbilt has on the railroad industry, and Norris is just exposing that monopoly in hopes to draw attention and knock it down a peg, like how Tarbell tried to do the same with the oil industry. The final person, W.E.B. Du Bois, who we've talked about previously in the Unit 5 reconstruction video, where he was urging for more of a violent in your face approach toward rapid progression for African Americans, and that was what he was tackling, the status of African American citizens. He founded the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and the organization does see success. It sees a lot of success, and the main thing that it does see success in is that it dismantles the grandfather clause. So we have American citizens in general getting more political power with referendum recall and initiative, but we also see African Americans gaining some power too with the grandfather clause being dismantled, where they have one less restriction on their voting rights. Boom. There's no transition. Okay. Women's rights. So before the progressive era, women's rights was on a very steady increase. First, we had Lowell Mill girls in Massachusetts who show that women can succeed outside of a domestic house, like a domestic life. Because women were pretty much confined to that kind of domestic life. They were like think about like if you go to like a colonial, like if you watch like a colonial movie, you'll see women more confined to that like housewife type of role. But the Lowell Mill girls were radical. They abstained from the norm, and they showed that they can be successful outside of like this sphere of like women's like the woman lifestyle. And there is a term for this. It's the cult of domesticity, where it was just like this I mean I pretty much just said it. It's the sphere of just women's culture living like the sphere of women living a domestic lifestyle, and Lowell Mill girls show that they can escape that. And Seneca Falls also shows that they can escape that as its progression in the women's rights movement, where women can progress where they are societally. And Seneca Falls sort of is like a little mini American Revolution for women in a way. It's their little Declaration of Independence, and it kind of mimics that too. The Declaration of like they have the Declaration of Sentiments, where it discusses how men and women are equal, and that in and of itself was a very major stepping stone that would here during and after the progressive era would severely progress women's rights. And let's start with temperance movement and the Women's Christians Temperance Union. So you might think, wait, this is tackling more of alcoholism rather than women's rights, but really, the two movements were very closely intertwined because the whole reason that the temperance movement sprouted up is because men were being abusive toward their wives because of the influence of alcohol. So because of that, a lot of the temperance movement was filled with women, like women supporters, and they were the people who were primarily advocating for temperance, and all that would come to fruition with the 18th Amendment, a significant win not only for temperance because it was the Prohibition Amendment, it banned alcohol, but it was a significant win for women because then they wouldn't like it showed that they are possible of causing change. They don't need to be bound towards this life of a housewife. They can be activists, they can be supporters, they can cause change. But more directly toward the women's rights movement, we have Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who serves as like the figurehead, the leader of the women's rights movement during this, and much later down the line after World War One, we have the 19th Amendment gets it gets it's here now, and that's just women's rights. So I mean, women's voting rights. Excuse me, that's women's voting rights. But yeah, as we see, massive change comes during this time period, and it all kicks off with the Seneca Falls Convention. Theodore Roosevelt, I talked earlier about he was one of my favorite presidents. Excuse me, I'm talking way too fast, but he's one of my favorite presidents, and that's for a couple of reasons. Because not only did he help regulate the economy, which we're going to talk about here, but he also aided in imperialism, which we'll talk about in the next video. But for now, let's talk about Theodore the Trustbuster Roosevelt, who worked towards dismantling and knocking down monopolies and making sure that they don't exist. And same with trusts. And we see this with the Sherman and Clayton Antitrust Acts, where the Sherman Antitrust Act, if we're going to be real, it was an effort towards diminishing the power of industrialist monopolies, but really it wasn't really enforced until Theodore Roosevelt came into power. And he used the Sherman Antitrust Act to knock down a lot of the knock down a lot of the monopolies present. And the Clayton Antitrust Act only like enhanced that, like I said. Interstate Commerce Act was something else that hadn't really been used until Theodore Roosevelt came into play. And what it did is that it like it like again it just knocked down like the massive influence that businesses and like industrialists had on commerce, and he was damaging the power of a commerce monopoly, pretty much. Yeah. Pure Food and Drug Act. That was just I'm pretty sure even in eighth grade you've heard of it. This might just be something to get your memory to jog, but it was regulations on food and on anything that was in like a factory for food. Cause you like if you had O'Brien, he's gonna show like he might have just shown you that photo of like the rats and the hot dogs, like the rats are in the meat. And once that got exposed, like Roosevelt immediately acted on that with the Pure Food and Drug Act, making sure that there was no unsanitary items inside of your food or anything like that. But yeah, Theodore Roosevelt made a lot of, wow, excuse me, very important because of his efforts towards busting monopolies and working towards diminishing the power of big business. And he's important because next unit we're going to talk about imperialism. And pretty much just like how America becomes a world superpower, how America becomes like as powerful as we know today. That's like kind of like the beginning steps of it. We're gonna go into World War One, Great Depression, New Deal, and World War Two. So yeah, very much a jam-packed video for next unit. Very long. I hope I don't break an hour, because that is a lot of talking. So I will see you guys later.